Who are the Neo-Confederates? Neo-Confederate groups are organizations, movements, or typically speaking, it's individuals that promote a romanticized view of the Confederate States of America, which is typically abbreviated as the CSA, or a romanticized view of the Civil War and the role that the South played in the Civil War. Generally speaking, these groups often advocate for the preservation of Confederate monuments, specifically like public monuments, like statues. Also, for the preservations of, there's a big debate, I think, back in the early 2000s about state flags, such as the state of Georgia and South Carolina, flags that included Confederate flags, as well as keeping like Confederate flags on like state license plates and stuff like that. Keeping Confederate symbols and remnants of the Confederate visible in public places is typically, if they're getting like politically involved, this is usually what they're aiming for or what they're protesting about or arguing about. Now, these Confederate groups usually argue for a form of what's called the lost cause narrative, which I'll briefly outline in this video, and promote an ideology that is closely related to views of white supremacy, oftentimes relying on historical revisionism, and typically oppose things like, at least historically speaking, oppose things like the Civil Rights Movement, which is usually why those monuments were put up in the first place. So this video might seem like an odd one. It's a little bit of an odd one for me to make. I was browsing Facebook recently, like an old man, and I came across a recommended page for the Palmetto Confederates, which is a branch of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, I believe is the abbreviation. What is the acronym? Let me look this up here. Sons of Confederate Veterans. Yeah. So I want to make a video on this because I've made several videos on my channel concerning pseudo-history and concerning pseudo-intellectuals that promote pseudo-history. And this is a common form of pseudo-history that me, especially being born and raised in the American South and being a history teacher in the American South, that I oftentimes come up against. Now, I have other videos on my channel addressing the actual history and the causes of the American Civil War. If you're interested, I'll also post some additional educational links that will go into depth about the reasons and the causes for the American Civil War. This video is mostly to address these to explain who these neo-Confederate groups are and the sort of political and belief systems that go into it, specifically this understanding of the lost cause narrative that's being promoted. Let me go ahead and warn my viewers, warn you, the people who are watching this, that I am going to be showing the Facebook page that I found, and on that Facebook page, it's going to display some prominent Confederate battle flags, symbols, and imagery that invoke the Confederacy. And as a result, if any of you are sensitive towards issues of racism and discrimination, then you may want to just listen to this video on audio. But I think it's an important topic to understand because obviously there's a lot of people who still kind of buy into these false pseudo-historical narratives, which is why I want to cover this. So let's go ahead and get into it. So what is pseudo-history? Pseudo-history refers to the distortion or fabrication of historical facts. And we're distorting these facts, the pseudo-historians distorting these facts almost always in order to promote a particular agenda or a certain type of narrative that's going to be used to support agenda. Pseudo-history will oftentimes masquerade as legitimate history. It'll sometimes, a lot of times, draw upon the same sorts of evidence and fact that actual historians will draw upon, but will use their narrative to spin those facts in a different way. Now, there's a lot of different examples of pseudo-history. I've covered a lot of different examples on this channel. Specifically, if any of you are familiar with Graham Hancock, I have several videos on Graham Hancock. Graham Hancock is famously a pseudo-historian, promotes pseudo-historical ideas, pseudo-archaeological ideas specifically. And what we're going to get with the lost cause narrative is a similar thing, because to me, what connects pseudo-historians, pseudo-archaeologists, I'm going to put all these people in the same group, is what I like to call they put the cart before the horse, so to speak. So history, generally speaking, tends to build and construct, at least how it's supposed to be. It tends to build or construct narratives based off of the available facts. So when the historian looks at the past, he's looking at what we can identify as historical facts, pieces of written evidence, pieces of archaeological evidence. In the case of the Civil War, there's a tremendous amount of evidence to go off of. You're talking about everything from the clothes the soldiers were wearing, the food that they were eating, the weapons that they were using, all the way to like big picture things like the manufacturing capabilities of various cities, the types of factories that were there. We have written sources, both at a governmental level. We have state governments writing to each other. We have politicians writing to each other. But in the Civil War, where literacy is growing, we have soldiers that are writing letters to their family. So all of that taken together is what we would consider the evidence that we're drawing upon here. And based off of that evidence, historians construct a particular narrative. Well, what pseudo historians typically do is they posit a narrative first and then try to find ways that the evidence fits that narrative. So I have here, and this is coming from Sarah Cook, who kind of outlined the three big features of pseudo history. First and foremost, it purports to be true. That is, it's purporting to be true over and against the common historical consensus. So there is a traditional historical consensus about why the Civil War was fought, kind of the general reasons why the Civil War is fought. And in the case of pseudo history, as we'll see with the lost cause narrative, the explanation that is given as truth goes against what is commonly accepted. But it's important to note that the reason why the historical consensus is the commonly accepted narrative is because that's where the evidence tends to be pointing. That's not to say that the consensus can't ever be wrong. It oftentimes is. That's actually the job of academic historians. They're pushing with the publication of their articles and their books. They're typically pushing against this common narrative. But like I mentioned before, with putting the cart before the horse for the pseudo historian, there's actually not a lot to actually back up the narrative that they're pushing. They're just saying this narrative is true, but there's not really a lot of evidence to support the validity of the narrative itself. That's a long, roundabout way of saying all that. Hopefully, that made a little bit of sense. Which gets into the second point, that the narrative either contradicts or goes far beyond the evidence. In the case of the lost cause narrative, as we'll see, it's ignoring or downplaying certain types of evidence and overplaying or over exaggerating other types of evidence, but I'll save that. And most importantly, pseudo history has an agenda. It has some sort of moral or political component that it's trying to push, that it's trying to get across. So let's go ahead and talk about how the lost cause narrative is a form of pseudo history. As I was saying before, the lost cause narrative is a pseudo historical interpretation of the American Civil War, interpretation of why the Civil War happened, why the South seceded, and kind of a reinterpretation the part that the North and Northern politicians played in that war. It presents a very distorted view of the Confederacy. Tends to be the focus of it. The leaders of the Confederacy, and especially a distorted view of the causes or the reasons why the war was fought in the first place. And what we get with the lost cause narrative is kind of a romanticization, I can't say that word, is a romanticizing of the past, a romanticizing of the Confederacy, of Confederate generals, especially, is a lot of times what you see in the literature, at the expense of downplaying other features of the war and downplaying other features of Southern society. Of course, what I'm talking about here is a major downplaying of the role that American slavery played both in causing the American Civil War and the role of slavery in Southern society and what slavery meant for Southern society as a whole. So, the lost cause, again, three general features here that I think we can point out. First and foremost, it tries to make, when you're looking at like the causes of the Civil War, how could such a thing like the American Civil War happen? The lost cause will purport that the primary driving issue, the primary driving political question and problem of the 19th century was states' rights. And this is going to be them purporting states' rights as the major issue over and against slavery. And this goes back to when I talk about like a misrepresentation of the facts. This narrative ignores the entirety of Southern history up until the 19th century, what the entire Southern economic system was predicated on, what the entire Southern cultural system was predicated on. If you are interested in Southern history and want to kind of do a deep dive into Southern history, especially Southern culture and the role that slavery played, I would highly recommend there's a historian power team, Elizabeth Fox Genovese and Eugene Genovese. They've written, here we are, we're over here. They've written a lot of fantastic books on the history of the American South. This is what I'm reading now, called The Mind of the Master Class, that gets into kind of the culture of the South. But the lost cause narrative will downplay slavery at the expense of overplaying the fact of overplaying how much of the Civil War was actually about states' rights. And by making the central issue states' rights, what they are in fact doing is taking away some of the teeth, some of the brutality, some of the horrors, a lot of the horrors of American slavery, and underplaying just how brutal American slavery was. And lastly, and you'll especially see this in some of the memes that we'll look at, as well as a lot of the literature that's produced by people who support the lost cause, even in films about the Civil War, is a romanticization of the Confederate generals, Confederate leaderships, and in some cases, the Confederate soldiers as being kind of like these noble, heroic figures. You can see, for example, this in popular films such as Gettysburg. Well, I say popular. I'm kind of dating myself there. It's a very old film, and Gods and Generals, right? The portrayal of these men as virtuous, godly men who are only fighting in order to protect their homeland, ignoring the fact that they're also fighting to protect their practice of slavery, right? Okay, so what initially caused me to make this video was my stumbling across this Facebook page called the Palmetto Confederates. This group, in their introduction, God is first proud. I'm not sure what exactly that's. And if, by the way, if any of y'all have insights on this, please let me know in the comment section, because some of these phrases I'm sure means something and refer to something, but I'm not quite sure what it is. Some of it I recognize, and some of it I can trace the kind of lineage back, so to speak, but let me know. So if God is first proud, unreconstructed Southerners. So this is referring to the Reconstruction period that happened in the South following the Civil War. Unreconstructed, meaning that they weren't infected. They weren't affected by Reconstruction. They didn't buy into the Union propaganda, is what I'm guessing they're going with that. Honor our ancestors down here in Dixie referring to the South. Member of the SCV, Sons of Confederate Veterans, MOSB. I'm not sure what that refers to. So the Sons of Confederate Veterans is an organization. This is their website. It's got some information about them. They have a YouTube channel. I'm going to check that out in the future. I'll probably make some videos on that. This is the description that they have. The Sons of Confederate Veterans, yada, 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 shall be strictly patriotic. Not really quite sure what that means in this context. The Civil War was about the Southern states seceding from the Union. Are they patriotic? I'm guessing they're saying they're patriotic towards the Confederacy. I don't know. Historical, or in this case, revisionist, right? They're revising the historical content. Educational, fraternal, because it's for men. There's also a daughters of the daughters of Confederate veterans. Benevolent, again, I'm not sure what that's referring to. Non-political, non-racial. Go ahead and getting that out the way, even though, again, that's going back to the downplaying of the role of slavery in the American Civil War. The Sons of Confederate Veteran neither embraces nor espouses acts of ideology or racial and religious bigotry. So they're separating themselves from more, I guess, violent groups, maybe such as the Ku Klux Klan or something like that, which also uses this imagery, which is maybe why they're trying to do that. Condones the misuse of sacred symbols and flags. And this is really, it seems like a lot of what they do is protecting or attempting to protect the display of Confederate monuments, Confederate flags, especially on state run like license plates and in state parks and in public places and stuff like that. But let's go back to the Facebook page. So some of these ideas that I talked about are going to be visible on the Facebook page. We got a lot of memes, a lot of display of flags. We got some representation, right? Some propaganda here, especially with an African American holding a Confederate flag. Again, wanting to make it less about the racial issue and more about the perceived political issue of states' rights. I'm guessing that's why they put that picture on there anyway. So a couple of things I found a little confusing was especially a post like this. It's confusing to me because well, let me just read it. So regardless of how Marxists, I'm not sure how Marxism came to play a part in the revisionist pseudo-historical history of the lost cause narrative, but we have Marxists in the mix now. Regardless of how Marxists try to re-engineer our history in order to destroy our republic, the flag, this symbol has always meant defiance against tyranny. So it's a little, we got some irony here. Of course, not intended to be irony, of accusing Marxists as creating revisionist history, when in fact this whole page is dedicated to revisionist history. And then going back again, this symbol, what does this flag represent? It represents defiance. Sorry, I said defense. That's my dyslexia kicking in. Defiance against tyranny. They're standing up to tyrannical government. Again, it's about states' rights over and against any sort of protection of the institution of slavery or anything like that. So I just wanted to briefly cover that. I'll probably do a deep dive into their YouTube channel if y'all are interested. Again, this is the lost cause narrative itself is something that I encountered a lot as a history teacher, especially in the South. That page, by the way, has like 10,000 likes or 10,000 followers. I can't remember which it is. Yeah, 10,000 followers. So I just felt like I should address this on some level to point out that they're promoting a form of the lost cause narrative. Anyway, if you have any questions, let me know, and I will see y'all all next time.